wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. Good morning, all our scholars, researchers, students, and our guest of honor today. Alhamdulillah, I think that's a great day today, having with us here two renowned scholars, Professor Dr. Armando Salvatori and also Dr. KEIKO Abisi. They are both from McGill University, and they are really scholars in their own areas. Alhamdulillah, my conversation with Professor Armando before resulted in him being with us today here to have what we call a scholarly conversation on the study of Islam in the context of interreligious studies and intercivilizational dialogue, a kind of an important topic in the International Institute of Islamic Thought and Civilization. Brothers and sisters, our scholars, our guests of honor, let me just put you in the context of our discussion and conversation today, it was meant to be an intellectual conversation and discussion. That's why Professor Armando mentioned to me before, it's not about big numbers of people and putting it, that's why we didn't put it on Zoom and so on and so forth, but he wants to have a kind of intellectual and in-depth discussion and deliberation on the ideas that he would like to present to us. Brothers and sisters, maybe before we give the chance to Professor and to our doctor to present and to put us in the context of our intellectual conversation today, let me read a little of their biography. I found a lot of things to mention, but because of the time, I would like just to mention a few things. Professor Dr. Armando Salvatori, he is Barbara and Patrick Keenan Chair in Interfaith Studies, Professor of Islamic and Interreligious Studies, Associate Member, Institute of Islamic Studies. Professor Armando got his MA from University L'Orientale, Naples, PhD, European University Institute, Florence, and he is also Dr. Humboldt University, Berlin, correct? Armando Salvatori is a scholar of contemporary Islamic and comparative religion. His primary focus is on interreligious and trans-civilizational dynamics. Salvatore's overall approach is interdisciplinary. His methodologies rely largely on historical comparative sociology, social theory, and the sociology of knowledge. He is presently the Barbara and Patrick Keenan Chair in Interfaith Studies and Professor of Islamic and Interreligious Studies at McGill University. Professor Salvatori also has held professorial and research positions in University Berlin, University of Naples, L'Orientale, National University of Singapore, and also Australian National University in Canberra. His most recent single-authored book is The Sociology of Islam, Knowledge, Power, and Civility. Among his other recent publications are the chief editorships of the multi-authored works, the Willie Blackwell History of Islam, 2018, and the Oxford Handbook of Sociology of the Middle East, Oxford University Press, 2020-2021. Other books: The Sociology of Islam, as I mentioned, Knowledge, Power, and Civility, The Public Sphere, Liberal Modernity, Catholicism, Islam. Another one, Islam and the Political Discourse of Modernity, and many, many others, brothers and sisters. Maybe before we start our intellectual conversation, let me give you a brief account of our Dr. KEIKO Abisi. I hope I spelled it well. She is a scholar of religious studies with teaching experience in Thailand and Japan. She has a doctorate from the University of Oxford, UK, and have researched on the topics of Buddhism or Buddhist-Muslim relations, Islam in Japan, Japanese religions, and Thai Buddhism. She also worked as a visiting researcher in Kobe City University of Foreign Studies, Japan, lecturer in religious studies, Mahidol University, and also in other places. Also in the School of Oriental and African Studies. I think she got her master's from there. And she was also a Japanese teacher's training. She got this Japanese training certificate. Anyone want to do Japanese? We have already a great lecturer, a great teacher. So brothers and sisters, today I think this is a very important session. This is, I think, the first time in Istac in the last 2 years we are going for an intellectual conversation and discussion. And alhamdulillah, we have a very special team of participants today here, from Professor Osman Bakar, Professor Murad, Professor Khaliq, and our Dr. Prof. Hisham, and the rest of our scholars and students here. This is, I think, a special kind of an intellectual conversation where we wanted really to have dialogue and engagement that can result in things that can happen after this. It should not be the first. With this introduction, I welcome Professor Armando and Dr. KEIKO for starting the conversation today. Go ahead, Prof.
It's difficult to express, my feelings of recognition and how moved I am that I'm finally visiting this wonderful institution. I mean, the Institute for the Study of Islamic Thought and Civilization, about which I've read so much, and then being invited by Professor Abdulaziz, and then being the presence of the professors, scholars, and students of this institution. So we, KEIKO and I, thought to introduce ourselves today and to have a learning experience with all of you, so to have a conversation. I mean, as it was announced, more than giving a lecture, although we were honored to become part of the distinguished lecture series. So it's a kind of a kick-off, so to speak. We'll present part of our current work, so which might provide some entry points into the conversation that we would like to start, because our current joint work has to do with the themes of interreligious studies and intercivilizational dialogue, but it's a kind of specific case study which has also something to do with directly or indirectly with the history of Istac. As I tell you. So I would just say a few words at the beginning, introducing this little presentation, and then KEIKO will do the first part of the presentation, and I will do the second part. Okay? Okay. Yes. So KEIKO and I have been working on a project that we might call of intellectual and institutional history of knowledge production or production of knowledge on Islam that links the West and East, I mean, Muslim and non-Muslim scholars. And this is a history that starts at McGill, the place we are currently affiliated with. I mean, this university in Montreal, in Quebec, in Canada, and it starts in the early 1950s. And the particular link to this place is, first of all, due to the fact that Professor Said Muhammad Naguib Al-Attas studied at McGill in the early 60s. He probably arrived there in the late 50s already, particularly at the Institute of Islamic Studies, which I will tell you about in a few seconds. And that was the place also where for 3 years late Professor Ismail Raja Al-Faruqi was active as a scholar. I think also writing his book on Christian ethics. And I was also moved when I looked up on internet on our database in McGill and found the MA thesis of Professor Al-Attas, I mean, which is on Ranieri and the Wujudiyya of 17th century Aceh, and with a very long subtitle. So it was the beginning of his study on Hamza Fansuri and Nuruddin Ranieri. You might be familiar with. And in the very, preface or acknowledgements of this work, he introduces some of the characters we will talk about here. So I'm quoting from this acknowledgements, and this is a fantastic PDF because at that time, of course, it was only typewriter, but it's written perfectly. I really wish my students, my own graduate students, were able to write, I mean, this type of English, and also to get all the transliteration rights because sometimes we are very much behind that. So I'm quoting from what Professor Al-Attas wrote. I would like to acknowledge my indebtedness to Dr. Wilfred Cantwell-Smith, Director of the Institute of Islamic Studies, McGill, because this is the first character I'm talking about. And continuing quoting, whose help and encouragement has made this study possible. Then my special thanks are due to Dr. Muhammad Rasjidi, Associate Professor, Institute of Islamic Studies, who supervised my work with care and attention. As you probably know, Professor Rasjidi went back to Indonesia and became also Minister of Religious Affairs, I think, in the 60s. And then he continues to Dr. Fazlur Rahman, Associate Professor, Institute of Islamic Studies, McGill University, and Professor of Central Institute of Islamic Research in Karachi, Pakistan, for his assistance, particularly in readings, and this is maybe a bit surprised, in readings of relevant passages from Ibn Arabi, Futuhat al-Makkiyah, and Fusus al-Hikam. I mean, so this was Professor Fazlur Rahman, I mean, helping with Ibn Arabi. It might sound a bit surprising. And then we come to the second character I would like to talk about today, and also with the KEIKO. And thanks to Dr. Toshihiko Izutsu. At the time, Izutsu was only visiting McGill, and indeed it is indicated here as Professor of General Linguistics and lecturer in Classic Greek Philosophy, Keio University, Tokyo, Japan. And Professor Al-Attas was thanking him for his guidance in the linguistic field and for the keen interest he has shown in my work, in his work. Because this will be part of what we will talk about. We will talk about, I mean, and this is our project, what happened in McGill between the 50s and the 60s in this project of setting up a scholarly dialogue, not just a dialogue for mutual understanding, but a real scholarly dialogue of merging the different methodologies for the study of Islam at the Institute of Islamic Studies, founded by Wilfred Cantwell-Smith in 1952, and where professors, Al-Faruqi and Professor Fazlur Rahman were also key players, actors, and participants for a few years between the late 50s and early 60s, and where Toshihiko Izutsu came in also to help, so to speak, with this dialogue at the beginning of the 60s, and then staying for quite a long time until the mid-70s. And the second part of Izutsu's tenure at the Institute of Islamic Studies at McGill was actually in Tehran, because McGill opened a branch in Tehran in the late 60s. And this is where, and you might know more about that than we do, where Professor Alatas visited again Izutsu, I mean, in the mid-70s, when the McGill branch of the Institute of Islamic Studies in Tehran went bankrupt. Professor Izutsu moved to a new institution, which was at the time Imperial Institute for Studies of Hikmah, founded by Said Hossein Nasr. And I think that Professor Alatas was also was visiting there in the mid-late 70s and participated in this knowledge production in that institution. That institution still exists because it survived the revolution of 1978, 79. Just the adjective imperial disappeared, as you can imagine, of that institute in Tehran. So the story we are working on, I mean, this kind of storyline starts with Wilfred Cantwell Smith. Some of you might be familiar with. He was a scholar from Toronto, Canada. Actually, he was a quite progressive scholar, but also he was a committed Christian. He was from a Presbyterian family. So actually, he was for a few years spent in the 40s. After he spent some years between Cambridge and Oxford studying both Christian theology and Islamic studies. Some people say that he was biking between Cambridge and Oxford, because in one place, Oxford, he was studying Islamic studies. In Cambridge, he was studying Christian theology. After years spent there in the late 30s, and then the war started, and then he stopped studying for a while, and then they wanted to be posted in Punjab, in Lahore, and actually went there as a Christian missionary. Although he was a quite progressive thinker, and this is where he realized something important in Lahore, in Pakistan, in pre-partition Punjab. This was the latest years of British colonialism in India. He learned that the different religious communities interact with each other on the ground in very intense ways, which are completely different from the ways Western scholars of comparative religion have imagined the existence and the functioning of religious communities. So that is something completely different, from what comparative religion, which is a Western type of academic discipline, conceives of religions. But we make a little step back, and this is where I give the word to KEIKO, because before the war, or even during the war, something important happened in Japan, and this has to do with the other character of our study, which is Toshihiko Izutsu.
Good morning and salam alaikum. It's truly wonderful to be here, and as Armando already said, it is really truly a dream come true, and it's a very special occasion for me to visit finally Istac. Is that, of course, to meet all of you distinguished scholars, but particularly Professor Osman Bakar, who I had the pleasure to meet when I was working in Thailand at Mahidol University alongside a Professor Imtiaz Yusuf in this newly established Center for Buddhist Muslim Understanding, of which he was the director. And I learned a lot about dynamics of inter-religious developments in Southeast Asia. And that was definitely my important entry point into Malaysia. So for today, I would like to talk a little bit about the social and political cultural background of the birth, of Toshihiko Izutsu as a scholar of Islam, and probably more importantly, as someone, an individual who was truly captivated by Islam. And there was a lot of, there still is a lot of speculation about what his religion was. And some people believe that he was Muslim, kind of a crypto Muslim or secretly Muslim. Some people wanted to believe that he was Catholic. But as far as we know, he had a Buddhist background, and his father trained him when he was still very little, like 5-6 years old, trained him in Zen meditation. So it was a really strict religious and spiritual and also intellectual training he received from his dad. So, so in order to understand the blossoming of Izutsu as a scholar of Islam, who, by the way, he is known primarily outside in Japan. He was a man of many talents, as it were. So he's known for different parts of his expertise in different parts of the world. So outside Japan, maybe he is known as a comparative scholar of comparative spiritual traditions, comparative religion, maybe a scholar of Islam. In Japan, he is known for his translation of the Quran, which he translated twice. And so there you go. So the social, political, cultural background of the birth of Toshihiko Izutsu as an Islamic scholar. And then we have to be a little bit sensitive to the historical development around this time in Japan. So Izutsu was born in 1914. And around this time, there was already a growing interest in Islam among Japanese intellectuals, starting from the turn of the century. And this manifested particularly first in the admiration of Prophet Muhammad. And this initial interest was actually triggered by the volume on hero worship by Thomas Carlyle, which was published previously in the mid-19th century. So these Japanese individuals, including those professionally committed to Buddhism, including some Buddhist monks, scholar monks, they really appreciated the Prophet as a great spiritual leader who was actively involved in the betterment of society. So they looked at this very socially engaged aspect of the Prophet's life, and which they regarded as an embodying an ideal attitude and strength required to counter the Western imperialist hegemony. So fast forward almost 1400 years, they saw in the Prophet the ideal leader. And some people even compared him to some of the charismatic Buddhist leaders of historical times as well. So Japan's involvement with the Islamic world, starting with the collaboration between Pan-Asianist Japanese intellectuals and Pan-Islamist, especially Tatar Muslim activists, and followed by the so-called Islam policy of the Japanese authority and the keen effort by them, especially the military authority, to promote research on Islam and the Islamic world. All of that was actually built on this general interest in Islam already growing among Japanese intellectuals. So it was really not the top-down imposition of sort of appropriation or appreciation of Islam, but it's more like they built on what was already developing there. And then this was around the 1930s. So in other words, we can say that genuine intellectual interest from below was also instrumental in making this sort of more official opening, official rapprochement or approach to Islam, much more than just a political move by the government and military circles and corporate interests. Yeah, and then I think that is also something that facilitating an appropriation of Islam through explicitly Japanese lenses, rather than just appropriating latest Western scholarship on Islam for political purposes. And indeed, lots of the early Japanese scholars of Islam during this time, like 30s and 40s, they were very self-aware of their role and task or goal of overcoming Eurocentric understanding of Islam. So although they started with, obviously, from the latest scholarship on Islam, but they really tried to overcome and outgrow that Western, what they saw as the Western prejudices on Islam. And as you probably know, the Islamic realm of the world was understood as integral to Asia in this Pan-Asianist frame of thinking, and also the Orient. So here you can see that the Orient, with word Orient, is appropriate with a much more positive and expansive dynamic meaning from the Orientalist scholarship, but given a new meaning. And there, Islam was often admired as a form of political messianism, heralding an era of liberation from Western global hegemony. And the one important and interesting example of such a Pan-Asianist Japanese intellectual who studied Islam was Shumei Okawa. And Okawa is, unfortunately, is primarily known as a super leading Pan-Asianist and ultra-nationalist ideologue, and he was held responsible for all the war crimes after the war. But he was actually liquidated because he developed some mental problems after the war, so he didn't have to stand. He left the court anyway. But this person actually had a profound influence on Izutsu, which is maybe quite surprising. So Okawa had a profound personal interest in Islam, despite the impression that we might get from his political use of Islamic ideas. He started with a really deep personal interest in Islam, and this is actually also noted by Izutsu himself. So Okawa's interest started with Sufism, mystical strand of Islam, and then the person of Prophet Muhammad. And these two went slightly to the background during his politicized activities, but after the war, they came back to become his main interest. And then, so while he was recovering from this illness in the post-war period, he wrote about Muhammad, and also he translated the Quran. Okawa only knows only some Arabic, so it was a sort of translation on the basis of all the other Western languages that he wrote. He read, but it was he went back to these two interests, right? And this is interesting because that is almost the same set of interests that Izutsu started with. Izutsu started with the interest in Muhammad. He actually wrote a biography of Muhammad twice, when he was young and when he was old. And also he relied a lot on Sufism or mysticism to connect different traditions later in his life. So there's a lot of comparability or even continuities between what Okawa was doing and Izutsu was doing. Right. So this is the general ethos in which Izutsu came of age, with the general interest in Islam growing in Japan. So by the time he finished university, he studied linguistics at Keio University. Izutsu already knew Greek very well as some Hebrew and Arabic. So he was intensely interested in all these important languages that are let's say, the languages of scriptures. But it was in 1937 that we can say that he properly encountered Islam, because he already knew some Arabic, but he wanted to know study Arabic more properly. And this is when he met in Tokyo the leading Tatar scholar and activist Abdul Rashid Ibrahim, who later became the first teacher not only of Arabic but also of Quran for Izutsu, because apparently Izutsu went there for some via some kind invitation of introduction of someone. We don't really exactly know who is. Maybe it might have been Okawa. And he wanted to know just Arabic. And then this old established prestigious imam said to him, like, if you want to know Arabic, I'm not going to just teach you just Arabic. If you want to know Arabic, you have to study the Quran. Only on that condition, I will teach you Arabic. And that was beautiful. I think he got completely hooked up by it. And Izutsu discipleship with such a Muslim public personality coincided with the time that this Ibrahim attained the top of his fame in Japan, as was appointed the Imam of the brand new Tokyo Mosque in 1938. Right, and then, so it didn't stop there. So Izutsu learned very quickly, Arabic, Quran, everything. And then at some point, Ibrahim said, okay, son, he was actually calling him son. Son, there is nothing more I can teach you, but I can introduce to an even greater scholar. And so came the Izutsu's second teacher in Arabic. Again, the leading Muslim reformer and intellectual of the age, Musa Bigiev Jarullah. So Musa recognized Izutsu's remarkable intellectual capacities and transmitted him a sense of trans-regional mobility in the quest of knowledge. I mean, he was allegedly, he didn't own any books. This Imam Musa didn't carry any books, but he remembered all the books in his head. And then Izutsu was really impressed by this thing. So, all in all, thanks to their keen mentorship and obviously great response from Izutsu as a disciple, Izutsu became the first Japanese author to systematically study Arab thought. Because before him, I don't think there was anybody who knew Arabic so much to really carry out in-depth study of Islamic thought and let alone the Quran. And so to this, he dedicated his first book publication in 1941. Now, in his study, he was greatly facilitated again by Okawa, Shumei Okawa, I mentioned earlier, because he allowed the young Izutsu to use all the latest literature on Islam that he had brought from Europe. He just ravishly spent his funds to buy the latest books from Germany, Netherlands, that. So he was allowed to have the free access to this scholarship sources. Also, Izutsu taught later at the school Okawa himself established to train young Japanese men in the languages and cultures of various Asian countries, where they would be sent to serve because it was during the war time, right? And this is not something that he publicly said, but Izutsu even allegedly wrote most of Okawa's bestseller volume on the general introduction to Islam. So this shows how closely they worked together. And yeah, and throughout his life, Izutsu was very quiet about his pre-war involvement with these military circles. And more in general, he never made explicitly political statements, but in one of the rare interviews he gave towards the end of his life, Izutsu talked about his involvement with Okawa. Maybe he thought it was like okay to talk about it now. So we are in the process of still discovering what this kind of early, not only involvement between Izutsu and Okawa, but how early Japanese exploration of Islamic studies was unfolding in this context. Yeah. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Keiko. And so how does the story continue? First of all, just a little annotation here. I think it was important to go back to this initial period of maturing of Izutsu's interest in Islam, even if it coincided largely with this type of climax of Japanese competitive imperialism and colonialism, which clearly brought so much destruction and of course also exploitation of Muslim majority nations, including here. I mean, in Malaysia, as you know, was under Japanese occupation between, I think, 1941 and 1945. But it was also important to emphasize that there was a genuine interest in Islam maturing in Japan from before the start of militarism, actually from the beginning of the 20th century. And as I said, with this type of merger between a kind of genuine intellectual, not rabid Pan-Asianism and Pan-Islamism. There are very interesting books about the collaborations about these two major trends, one by Jamil Aydin, from which we learned a lot. But now the question is, what happened after the war? After the war, Izutsu found a job at Keio University. He put to fruition the knowledge of many languages, and he wrote his first translation. I mean, he worked at his first translation of the Quran into Japanese, because then later on he authored the second one. This was all during the 1950s. This was in parallel to the first years of this experiment of the Institute of Islamic Studies at McGill, which was founded by Wilfred Cantor Smith. So there are two parallel histories during the 50s where Izutsu and Smith do not know each other, where Smith is very intent in building this forum of scholarly dialogue at McGill, which was first located at the Faculty of Divinity. But then he wanted to go out of that because there was a certain hegemony of Christian theologians, and so he got out of the Divinity Hall, and then he opened up something which is not as beautiful and grand like here, but it was also a little mansion on the hills on the Mont Royal, actually, outside of the campus of McGill University, which became the seat of the Institute of Islamic Studies. And it is there that he started to invite, to woo, to co-opt Muslim scholars and graduate students. So I really wanted to create a new type of methodological dialogue between the Western, still Orientalist methodologies of Islamic studies and the Muslim tradition of the study of the Quran, Hadith, Tafsir, and other genres, I mean, including, Tasawwuf and Falsafa and Kalam. So this was a kind of experiment. He got funding for that, and then among the people he was able to invite, as we said at the beginning, were also Ismail Raj al-Faruqi, who had the additional advantage of being interested in studying Christianity, and then Fazlur Rahman. I have to say that this is the negative part of the story, that the ambition of this scholarly dialogue was pitched so high. So the idea was really to produce a merger between these different methodologies. Somebody recently has called this a fusionist methodologies, the fusion between a certain rigor in a kind of philological analysis of text, like the one that also Said Al-Attas did on the text of Fansuri, and then the also very sophisticated disciplines of Islamic studies within the Muslim tradition. So it was a very ambitious goal. But to say the truth, I mean, there are increasing works witness to the fact that by the late 50s, this project was in a state of crisis. And then there were also these manifestations of disappointment among Muslim graduate students and scholars, including al-Faruqi himself. He was not entirely happy with the situation there. This is when Wilfred Cantwell Smith had an idea. Somebody had signaled to him that a scholar from Japan, whose name was Toshiko Izutsu, had written a book on the Quran, the structure of ethical terms in the Quran, and published in English, but by the Keio University Press in Japan. And the book landed in the hands of Wilfred Cantwell Smith and said, oh, we found something interesting here. We found somebody who is neither Western nor Muslim. And then he was talking about him also to his former mentor from Oxford, who is a quite well-known Orientalist, Sir Hamilton Gibb. And then he said, what about we might revive the dialogue by inviting a kind of a third person? I mean, somebody who might almost be, beyond this kind of face-to-face, tense face-to-face between Western Orientalist scholars and scholars of Islam. So Izutsu became a kind of wild card to play for Smith in this kind of agonizing dialogue. And so he invited him to McGill just for a first visit or stint. Exactly at the beginning of the 1960s, was January 1960, was very cold at McGill. But Izutsu came from a position of strength because he had just got a fantastic type of scholarship. We would all like to have 2 years paid for just traveling around. He went to the Middle East. It was the first time he left Japan in 1958. He went first to Cairo, where he met a lot of Muslim scholars, and then also perfected his Arabic. This is why he decided, oh, later on I will have to retranslate the Quran into Japanese, because he needed a better knowledge of Arabic. Then he went to Lebanon, Syria, and then to Turkey, and then to Europe. Actually, I didn't like Europe very much, I mean, from a point of view of scholarship. So he went then from France to Canada, to Montreal. And then there was this meeting with Wilfred Cantwell Smith. It was a very positive meeting. Izutsu started to lecture at McGill for a couple of months and then came back every year in the 1960s until he got a full professorship towards the end of the decade. But the beginning of the 60s were important because that's exactly the period when Izutsu presence overlapped with when Said Al-Attas was there as a graduate student, when Al-Faruqi was still there, and Fazlur Rahman. So all 5 people were there at the same time at McGill. I mean, Smith, Izutsu, Al-Attas, Faruqi, and Fazlur Rahman. So it was a kind of meeting of minds. They were not all on the same pages, where they were clearly having a lot of dialogues and also conversations, which sometimes were tense, also about methodologies. The book that Izutsu published in the late 50s, which had mesmerized Smith, there's a book published recently by a scholar called Megan Brankley-Abbas. Just trying to see the title and put it correctly for you. I don't want to misquote. The title is called Who's Islam? The Western University and Modern Islamic Thought in Indonesia. There is a chapter which is entirely dedicated to this 1950s at McGill, and then with the presence with a lot of Indonesian graduate student and professor, including Rasjidi, who was the mentor and the supervisor of Professor Said Naqib Al-Attas. And so during this period, apparently there was the meeting between Al-Faruqi and Izutsu, and Al-Faruqi did not like the methodology used by Izutsu, which was an analysis of semantic linguistic networks in the Quran. So not analyzing isolated keywords, okay, but semantic networks. Al-Faruqi first thought this was a kind of a bad mimicking of Western methodologies. It was furious. I mean, this is a very kind of recent discovery, because the Megan Brankley-Abbas apparently interviewed some people. This is not in any written sources, because we are trying to get into archival sources about all these relations and networks. We didn't find anything about that. Later on, there was a kind of reconciliation between Izutsu and Al-Faruqi, also mediated by Fazlur Rahman. As you know, both Al-Faruqi and Fazlur Rahman left McGill in the early 60s, went to Islamabad. They didn't stay very long. I think Professor Imtiaz Yusuf also tells the story why they didn't like to be in Islamabad, and they went back to the US and became very successful scholars in the US. But Izutsu visited both of them, and then so they were becoming friends. I mean, so there was a kind of development and mutual understanding also in terms of the methodologies they used. And in a recent conference dedicated to Izutsu in Japan, there was a Turkish scholar who said that actually in the Islamiyat faculties in Turkey nowadays, the two main methodologies for studying the Quran are inspired by two scholars. One is Fazlul Rahman, and the other one is Izutsu. So there was there is a kind of competition and dialogue between their respective methodologies. So what is really remarkable about the story, I think, is that, you know, when we talk about dialogue, we have to know that we have to put all cards on the tables, and there is sometimes also difficult discussions to conduct. And because it's not just identities or goodwill that are at stake, but also methodologies. And then to bridge methodologies, some which originates from a Western colonial Orientalist approach, and others which originates from this time-honored traditions. I mean, it's very difficult. I mean, so it's not something that can be done just in a couple of years. But this is something that we treasure by being at McGill. So something that when we arrived at McGill less than 10 years ago, I mean, first me and then KEIKO, actually it had been completely forgotten. So people and colleagues at Institute of Islamic Studies didn't pay any attention to that. Actually, our first kind of platform of action, and from where we are conducting this project. And McGill is not even the Institute of Islamic Studies, but it's the School of Religious Studies, from which the institute, you know, seceded or got separated. Because nowadays at the Institute of Islamic Studies at McGill, colleagues, and we have a lot of good friends there, they say, oh, actually, we don't deal with religion at the Institute of Islamic Studies. There's a kind of, you know, reluctance to say, you know, because the notion of religion is kind of overloaded. It's considered to be a very Western colonial notion that does not even translate nicely into Islamic ideas of deen and the semantic networks connected with that. They say, no, we don't study religion. So they kind of wanted to mainly forget about this, the story of how everything happened, how everything started with this foundation of the Institute. And while we want to do the opposite, we want to retrieve this history, but also not just consign it to, you know, to some kind of past chapters, but try to revive it, so to speak. And one other important element of the kind of program of Wilfred Cantwell-Smith was that he knew about the importance of the new emerging post-colonial nations of Southeast Asia. He was actually a precursor of the idea that, first of all, there is a beginning of a new world, a new modern world, which is no longer a Western-centered world. He talked about a post-Western world, a world where the new nations, I mean, of Africa and Asia, have to take the lead also in creating new scholarship on Islam and in general on society. And I think this is a very important part of this heritage. And second, I mean, it was very much emphasizing what is now almost commonplace in many discussions and discourses, that the positions of the scholars are important. We talk about positionalities today. I mean, he is the first one who talked about that well, you cannot start a dialogue without making explicit the positions of the scholars and also the inherited power relations. The third very important heritage is that in his book, The Meaning and End of Religion from 1962, which was also the same period when he first met Izutsu, and indeed there are some traces of this first dialogue of Izutsu in a couple of places in the book. In that book, Wilfred Cantwell-Smith for the first time started to criticize the Western-centered notion of religion inherited from a kind of Latin Christian tradition of the notion of religio. And even the Islamic notion of deen is not exactly a match to that. Not to speak of, for example, of Dharma, of other notions from non-Abrahamic traditions. And then, as a scholar of comparative religion, he really thought that one has to renew this heritage of the comparative method, because it's a kind of rigged method. It's not an open, fair method, because it uses as a standard of comparison the notions that are inherited from the Western Christian and sometimes post-Christian secular type of understanding. So he could not complete this project, but he was the precursors of many important ideas that we are working on today. And so we didn't title our talk, you know, Izutsu and Wilfred Cantwell-Smith, because I think there is a much broader significance in that, which is the kind of retrieving this legacy and trying to update it nowadays. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Prof. Armando and Dr. Kayako. I think this is a very well blended kind of an introduction to the topic and how the germs of these ideas of approaches to Islamic studies have been developing in the context which they mentioned. And I think Izutsu and the other scholars have made a lot of contributions. I think we still need to study their contributions, their approaches, their views. I think though it's just an introduction, but they raised many issues because the topic today is talking about something serious, talking about Islam and Islamic studies and how these Islamic studies approaches and methodologies are developing. Maybe 10 years from now, we should have the Istac school, the Kuala Lumpur school, or the civilizational school of reconstructing how Islamic studies have been developed and how they should be projected in the future so that we can put our own inputs. And you see, our prof was talking about McGill, but Professor Latas present, Farouqi present, Professor Osman present, means we are there. So we need really to connect the dots and see how, especially Istac, which adopts the idea of civilizational approach to the study of Islam or the study of religion or the study of the other. So I think Prof and Doctor, thank you very much. It was really a great introduction. Let's open up for any comments, any questions, any clarifications, so that we move in our discussion in building this kind of an understanding of the methodologies of approaching Islamic studies. It's open for our professors, doctors, researchers, scholars. Please go ahead. Maybe we can start with our Professor Sheikh Osman. Come, go ahead, Prof.
First of all, thank you to both speakers, Professor Salvatore and Professor KEIKO. I'm happy to meet both of you again. Thanks to Prof. Bergud, the Dean, for having you here. Well, after listening to you both, I mean, you are reminding me of my younger days. And of course, there's all those major figures you mentioned who were associated with McGill. I belong to older generation. I mean, I was also their students, some of them formally, some of them informally. And when I was doing my PhD in 1981 at Temple University, of course, Professor Farouqi was there at the time. Practically, I mean, I was using a lot of the writings of Professor Attas, Professor Fazlur Rahman, Professor Farouqi, and also Isusu. Yeah. I think for the younger Muslims today, it is important to understand I will say, the historical role of McGill University in the Muslim intellectual development in modern times. The significance, because in a sense, McGill marked a new phase of Orientalism, mark a new phase, a more critical phase of Orientalism. In other words, it was leaving away the Harvard Seminary approach to Islam, associated with this Christian missionary works. So when you have people like, especially Fazlur Rahman, Faruqi, and Al-Atas, and Izusu, you have a different brand, you have a different kind of quality of scholars, and they're all great scholars. It's not doubt about it. And Izusu, for me, certainly one of the greatest modern scholars of Islam, and he's from the East, from Japan, from our part of the world. So I feel closer. I feel closer to Japan. Yeah, and certainly Izusu is one of my favorite. I mean, his mastery of Arabic, of Persian, of philosophy, mysticism, and then even translated. I said, the first translation of Arabic of the Quran into Japanese, and he inspired many young Japanese. I'm sure you are one of them. So I would like the younger students, Muslim students today, to appreciate that. Yeah. In fact, something yet to be written. Yes, is to be written. Please correct me. Has anybody, any Muslim, written about the historical role of McGill University in a sense chartering a new course? Of course, it's faith, history. It's also historical faith. It is faith because Professor Faruqi and Professor Fazlur Rahman had, in a sense, to seek asylum. Intellectual asylum. To seek intellectual asylum in Canada, in McGill, because they were, in a sense, expelled. They were expelled from Pakistan. Yeah. So they built an institution there with the hope that they could reform Islamic thought. But the challenge there. In other words, that tension, that conflict between tradition and modernity is still very strong. Yeah. So I think it's important to understand that how the voices of Orientalism, in a sense, have to entertain face to face there in the same place. The fact that they were all there physically, in the same place, there's no doubt they have to dialogue with each other. They have to dialogue with each other, and they're all great minds. You mentioned Cantwell Smith. Of course, Cantwell Smith is more, in a sense, is more rooted in the Indian Islam. He doesn't know that much about Malay Islam, but then as I see that, it is they have prepared a new ground for a new breed of Muslim scholars of Islam. Yeah. Of course, I think in the case of because I'm also a student of philosophy, I like Izusu. I think he was, I just want to share with you, because when I was before I went to do my PhD, most of my information about Izusu, I got it from Al-Atas. I used to spend a lot of time with him, so we talk about. No, two of us talk about this. So I said, want to know what kind of person is he? But from listening to him, I said, I couldn't find anything. What is it that he was writing about, was talking about that was against Islam? So at the time, younger said, was he Muslim? That thing, Al-Atas smile. Yeah. He said, he called me Brother Osman, Brother Osman. I used to also to be together with Izusu. I also asked that question. She also asked the question, are you Muslim? The only thing that he got was a smile from his associate and complete silence. He didn't say, he didn't say yes or no, he only smiled. All right, just to start with, but
Yeah, thank you, Prof. It's really a good information also for our scholars here and those who are studying Al-Attas, Al-Faruqi, Izutsu, and all these scholars. Actually, this context takes you to the history of ideas, how they start, how the context influences. I think I start connecting the dots and trying to understand the difference between Al-Attas and Al-Faruqi. In that context, they were there. How Faruqi developed the idea of Islamization and Al-Attas developed the idea of Islamization means there is somewhere a common thing. So I think this is the importance of this. So let's go ahead, Dr. Ayn.
Assalamu alaikum. Yes, I'm here.
Please.
So,
Okay. Who wants to go ahead? Go ahead.
yeah,
brother.
my name is Rizwan. I'm a student of Istac, so I study theology. So I have a question. When we talk about revival of Islamic branches of Islam, knowledge in Islam, do we just need to follow the framework that's been made by these great scholars of McGill, or because we have to admit that some of their studies is based on the context that they are lived in. So there are several things that they contributed that aren't relevant to us anymore. So do we need to invent a new wheel or just improve the existing?
Thank you for this question. Yes, this is a question that we are also asking ourselves, and also we will have to share some kind of answers also to those who will hopefully read what we will hopefully write about this. There are a couple of articles we have published or in the pipeline. We would like to write a book about this. So what is the knowledge status of what we are talking about here? So there is a component of intellectual history, history of ideas, and also institutional history of how institutions could collaborate with each other. And then a little profile of sociology of knowledge to know how knowledge is produced, which is important in itself, regardless of the output, because that output is dated, as you said. I mean, it's not that we are recommending that output for now. That's not what we are doing. On the other hand, there is something about that method of dialogue which might not be imitated, but we might learn from and update in order to produce not updated knowledge, and also building, for example, on the experience of Istac, of Istac-Iium, and other institutions of higher learning in Southeast Asia and in other parts of the Muslim majority world. If I can just open a little window here before I come back, I don't want to evade your question. There is something which also needs to be kind of assessed and maybe reevaluated about what the Institute of Islamic Studies did back then in the 50s and 60s, because they were particularly engaged with Indonesia. So there were a lot of Indonesian graduate students and scholars. And so part of what we are writing about, and then, for example, Izutsu himself was the supervisor of one PhD, only one actually, of one Indonesian graduate student who became famous in his own right. I mean, of course, it's he espoused a particular version of Islamic theology. It was a kind of neo-Mu'tazili, I mean, Nasution in Indonesia, became also, I think, I don't know if he became a minister. No, I mean, but a kind of high-ranking. Yes. And he studied with Izutsu. Izutsu didn't have a particular neo-Mu'tazili inclination, but sometimes you have to, you have to respond to the interests of your students. So basically, there was a policy, something like a post-colonial, maybe even post-neo-colonial policy of the institute, which we certainly are not espousing for today. because Canada was the good face of the West. It was not, like the US, it was like almost the soft academic power. So they could influence Islamic studies, including the build-up of Islamic universities in Indonesia. And this is something that I would not recommend today because we are not in the 60s. But who knows, maybe back then there was some benefit. I mean, having this support from McGill. I cannot judge. But the type of knowledge that was produced also through this kind of, let's say, also influence that the Institute of Islamic Studies had on Indonesian scholars, a few of which became also, high-ranking officials and sometimes even ministers in the educational sector and also in the Ministry of Religious Affairs. It still needs to be evaluated. Actually, the book that I mentioned of Megan Brantley Abbas is also about that. So one entire chapter is about the Institute of Islamic Studies in McGill, but it's about the impact of this kind of post-Orientalist attempt to reconstruct Islamic studies in the West, their impact on the Muslim, let's say, reform discourse. And I have to say that we, or at least I, am not recommending this. I mean, this is something past and something which is still a kind of neo-colonial aura. And this is not for us today. And correspondingly, the knowledge that has been produced, down the road, down the river, is not the knowledge that we want produced through a dialogue today. So it's not that I'm recommending this. So this might be just an inspiration to build another little break in this updated scholarly dialogue today. And by the way, yesterday we were in a really informal dialogue session at IIUM with scholars, colleagues, and graduate students from the Faculty of Revealed Knowledge and Human Sciences and different departments. I mean, we just wish to have dialogues particularly with three departments: Usuluddin and Comparative Religion, Sociology, because I'm mainly a sociologist of culture and knowledge, and Political Science, because political science is important. And our main host there was Professor Daniel Yusuf, who is also a member of Istac, I understand. Also because and also he was a student of Professor Y. Safi, who was also, we have to thank for having, in a way, suggested our visit to Professor Abdulaziz, Professor Y. Safi from the College of Islamic Studies at the Hamad bin Khalifa University in Doha, Qatar. There are all these networks of today. These are different types of networks. And in that sense, I mean, yesterday we were very explicit about talking what is the Islamic perspective in rebuilding this dialogue. In the book, The Sociology of Islam, that gracefully and thankfully Professor Abdulaziz was mentioning in this introduction, which is my latest single author book, I talked about an Islamic perspective, and I know that I mentioned the idea of an Islamic perspective. It's not just Islamization of knowledge, but adopting an Islamic perspective in the production of knowledge. I mean, without knowing that this was a kind of phrase used at IIUM, I used the same word in my book. I probably intended something which is different, yet probably dialogic and compatible with what the Islamic perspective adopted at IIUM and I think here too. So that might be the basis for a new dialogue. I mean, we were talking about this yesterday. It was a different type of conversation, and today was very informal, I have to say. There was no camera, nothing being recorded. It was completely off the record. But that's the kind of thing that I would we would wish to be engaged in, not recommending those old scholars. By the way, IIUM organized a conference dedicated to Izutsu in 2000, I think, 8, and there is a book edited by Professor Anis Toa, who is no longer at IIUM. I think it is in Brunei. Yeah, Brunei, yes. And this is an interesting book because, I mean, the editor himself, Professor Toa, was as the most negative chapter about Izutsu in the entire book. The book is, there are a lot of sympathetic pieces, but other pieces will say, no, I mean, Izutsu is outdated here, we cannot follow him and this and that. So, there are always two sides. I mean, clearly you cannot use outdated stuff. And also, he was really on the cutting edge of using linguistic methodologies of studying the Quran back in the 60s, but we are friends to very good scholars of linguistics and linguistic anthropologists, like in the US, who are interested in Izutsu's methodologies. They say, "Oh, this is a great scholar of linguistics," but clearly nowadays we have gone much beyond that. We cannot use the same methodologies, and of course there might be also an objection to using these linguistic methodologies in studying the Quran, and then this is actually what made al-Faruqi furious first. But then there was a reconciliation later on and the mutual explanation. So we have to keep a little bit neutral in terms of the status value of that all the knowledge, because we are a kind of historians of ideas here. And in a way, we want also to revive that type of atmosphere. In that sense, there is a kind of a positive bias in what we are doing. I mean,
yeah, that's great. Okay. Okay, Dr. Fatmir, go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu.
Our scholar of comparative
In Usuluddin, comparative religion, I'm from Albania. So when you mention here, I would like to have a bit more explanation when I look at the context of the time of Farouk and the great period that you mentioned, McGill University, and compared to our time. During the time, maybe we can say that was the flourishing period time of McGill University, that they invited great minds from other perspectives. And if you look later on the later development, if you look at Faruqi, rahimahullah, we can see a great school was established after his thoughts, compared to Fazlur Rahman, that he is blamed because of religious pluralism. Even contemporary context, some of them said that he, or maybe they have misunderstood it somehow, could be. And when you look at the interest that they had during the time at Izutsu, I can see that is the same interest that we look at today in the West, especially in the Humboldt University. I don't know whether in McGill University has the same interest, when there is a kind of revival related to Quranic studies, especially in the ex-communist countries. And they are investing a lot in order to revive. So the question is why they're trying to understand Islam through this kind of sources, instead of going directly to Muslim scholars. So what will be your answer to this? We have many great Muslim scholars during the time, even today, who understand Islam much better than like Izutsu, if I say that. So why, I mean, the McGill University targeted or was very, very much impressed by Izutsu, or the way you put it forward, knowing the fact that is because his background is more related to what McGill University is having the focus of the study, the interest of McGill University study. We have this sentence like in Humboldt now, Islamic studies, they have different interests. So my inquiry here would like to have some more explanation, because maybe they invest a lot related to the discipline, something that in the Muslim world, we don't see that. Muslim institutions, they don't invest to this kind of studies. So I don't know, how do you, and is there any opportunity, for example, that McGill University can give us some kind of opportunity to cope up with this kind of studies, maybe research, let's say in Istac, is that since you are coming from that and you are in the Islamic studies, McGill University, I don't know how it would be. We are ready to cope up. Maybe you can come directly to the right channel. This is my concern, you know. So thank you very much. Thank you very much.
This is very important, and I'm very grateful about what you said, because this is very critical kind of fault line in this knowledge production process. Were you mentioning Humboldt University? Huh? Which university were you mentioning?
Now they're
in Berlin?
Even in Berlin.
Okay, because this is the university where I completed my taught and then also completed my study. I have to say that what you said is extremely inspiring for me, because I never thought about this type of you know, in a way, comparison about what they started to do at the Humboldt University in Berlin, where I got my kind of habilitation thesis, I mean degree, but in sociology. And then what is the kind of maybe in a way, yes, fading tradition of Islamic studies at McGill, which we were trying to not revive, but to place again into a renewed comparative religion framework, or even comparative theology. And this is why I think that I wanted KEIKO to respond, because KEIKO is into comparative theology much more than I am. So I hope you can add to what I'm saying. So I have to say that knowing a little bit about the German background, there is as you know, I'm sure you also much better than I do, there has been something which has been also the product of all this kind of bad politics and policies in Europe by governments towards Muslim communities and Muslim minorities. I've been visiting only recently one particular center or department of Islamic theology, because they're called Islamic theology, right? And this was the one in Osnabrück. I don't know if you have any colleagues there, but I was very, very delighted to visit there in 2019. So it was long after I left Germany and Humboldt University. These developments happened after I left Germany. But one of my PhD supervisors, Rainer Schulze, I don't know if you heard of him, he was one of the main proponents of this departments or schools of Islamic theology. And there are quite a few of them in several places in Germany. By the way, I'm delighted to hear that you like that type of institution. And I'm following a few of them from afar. I think I was attending one online conferences done. Was it at Humboldt University, which was also about Buddhism and Islam. But I know that they are also employing very, very competent young Muslim scholars. Many of them also have a European Muslim background. So this is a way to be very optimistic in spite of the bad politics and policies of European governments towards Muslim minorities, to be very optimistic about the knowledge that can be produced in those contexts. I have to say, when I lived in Germany, I hoped that this could be an outcome of the Muslim life experience in Germany, to produce a new type of knowledge that might be appreciated also in the rest of the Muslim world. I remember that the period I was studying and doing research in Egypt, one of my interlocutors was philosopher Hassan Hanafi. He was extremely disparaging about all Muslim scholars in Europe. He said, they don't know anything about Islam. They live in a non-Muslim country. He considered himself a progressive scholar, but he was so negative. He means, we cannot listen to them. They don't have any real idea or experience of Islam. They will just kind of rehash European thoughts in a kind of Islamic garb. So you are telling us the opposite. So it's good news for me. After all, I come from Europe. So, and yes, you are giving us an idea about how we can also revive this study of Islam in a place like McGill. I'm just, and then of course, if you are talking about a potential also dialogue that we might start on those bases, I would be very much in favor of that. I just wanted to be very, in a way, sincere with you, and in saying that the Institute of Islamic Studies, as much as I love all their members who are our friends and good colleagues, is different from back then. Because there's been a traumatic experience about all this, legitimate, important type of decolonial critique of notion of religion, that they say, oh, they studied Islam but not religion. Maybe they don't even study Islam; they study literature, they study politics in Sudan, I don't know, politics in Pakistan, but they don't study what we might still call religion, even if that European notion is a little bit twisted to European interest, but it's still kind of religion, right? I don't have a problem. I'm a scholar of comparative religion, honestly. I'm still okay. I just think this should be built. Comparative religion should be built anew on more equal basis. And then taking into account the decisive contribution of Muslim scholars and also scholars of other traditions. So Christianity should not be at the center of comparative religion. But otherwise, thank you so much for your input. I try to make a treasure of it. But please, about comparative theology, I don't know if you want to say anything, because I learned so much from you, KEIKO, about comparative theology, which is again different from comparative religion, right?
Thank you for that really stimulating questions. That is something that has been really dear to me as a person rather than as a scholar. Because if you're interested in studying a religion that, let's say, that is not your own, in the first place anyway. I don't know if Islam is wholly other to myself at the moment. So when you think about understanding other religion while holding softly to these labels and the compartmentalization, religious identities, what I have come to realize nowadays is that there is no one correct understanding of one particular religion, and I'm stating the obvious. So even in the scholarly and more institutional question about employing Islamic perspective in understanding this and that, I don't think it can or it should be just one Islamic perspective, because we are all different human beings. Yes, we're coming from Islamic traditions. So that is the starting point for myself. So if, let's say, to put it very bluntly, okay, officially I am not a Muslim, officially. But my study of Islam has been driven by my idea or desire, or any scholar of desire to understand Islam, is not to understand Islam seen from somebody else's perspective. Yes, you're absolutely right in saying that, yes, some Muslims, there are great Muslim scholars of Islam. You can read about them, you can go to them. Yes, they may probably, most probably, they know much better about Islam, but I can only understand from my own perspective, right? So there is a not really a gray zone, but there is this kind of balancing act, because I wouldn't reach my perfect understanding of Islam by just reciting memorizing the best scholarship on tafsir, for example. I have to understand it from my own perspective. And as someone who's interested in not comparative religion, but also comparative theology, the idea is that your first step might be your wish to understand Islam, which is the other religion. But by studying Islam and trying to understand it better, you also sort of reflect that new knowledge so that you understand your own religion better. And in this kind of sort of circulation of knowledge within yourself and in your conversation with other scholars, you're producing new knowledge, also personally, but also scholarly, on a scholarly level as well. And this is a very sensitive field that we are all treading in, especially in comparative theology. And in that sense, it is thoroughly dialogic. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Doctor. Dr. Hisham.
Yeah, I just want to add a little bit.
Go ahead.
Yeah, personally, I love Izutsu after reading his Language and Magic. I mean, because I'm really into language. I know Persian, I know Arabic, I know many other languages. So he was actually into human thought. He was looking the human thought through a scripture, which is not with him. It's very creative. It's very, how do you say it? It's very different. It's an interreligious approach. It's an interfaith approach, which he is using to analyze human thought and to analyze a human being himself. So this is what is different from our Muslim community, which we only look into one road. And Izutsu is very creative, where he actually created a semantic theory to actually look into the human thought. And this is very creative and very innovative. Even though, it may not be related to, some people say the present time, but he looked into the Quranic scripture, which is related the past and now and maybe the current situation. So it's very, very what do you say, unique on how Izutsu can look into the Quran itself, take Quran itself and study Arabic language and looking language, the link between language and human thought and Quran itself. Yeah.
Very good.
Yeah.
Very good comment. Sure.
It's fascinating the way you presented the times in McGill, where it seems you guys actually took religion very seriously. I mean, what I mean is that the different scholars were interested in the religion itself as they were discussing it, and not the sociological context. In other words, now I'm a student of Fazlur Rahman actually, so that's why the interest. The current state of the Islamic studies has become area studies. It's no longer interested in the religion in itself. So, I mean, the McGill probably approached it very different from any American university. I was at Chicago, so the problem becomes very different. So we are trying to revive the religion as becoming a very important, or at least the basis for everything. So how do you see the changes? Will they change back? How did it become like this? And will it, I mean, the Americans have become, or the American studies of Islamic studies have become so area studies, so sociological, so political. It doesn't take the religion seriously anymore. So is there a way back?
Thank you. I mean, this is very close to my heart. And I might also start by saying something that I omitted previously, to say that in the present Institute of Islamic Studies, maybe there are 10 full-time faculty overall, and they are all good colleagues and friends. The largest majority are people with a Muslim background. I mean, those who say we don't study religion are people with a Muslim background. I mean, just to be fair to the, to the situation right now. And actually, the single one which I know he really studies religion, and he's also a member of religious studies. I mean, I'm kind of cross-appointed, and he's also cross-appointed. The difference is that I'm mainly within religious studies, and he's mainly within Islamic studies. Professor Robert Wisnowski. So he doesn't have a Muslim background. He's a scholar of Kalam and Falsafa, which I would also recommend. I mean, and especially the philosophy of science, and then philosophy of knowledge. I mean, this is a great colleague and friend. I mean, honestly, he's the only colleague with whom I could collaborate at Institute of Islamic Studies. We have conducted, joint initiatives and conferences. But initially, even he was skeptical about what we were doing. He said one needs a very good pair of binoculars to look back to those times from now, because he knew that he had been also the director of the Institute of Islamic Studies. So he knew that times had changed and there has been this kind of shift. So paradoxically, perhaps now, I mean, the kind of stronghold of the Islamic religious studies is not at the Institute of Islamic Studies, but it's at the School of Religious Studies in McGill, where we are located, and where there is still a kind of the heritage of comparative religion, of interreligious studies, which is a new chair, the one that I have the honor to occupy. And this is from this perspective that we are kind of, we have come here to learn, and then to listen to you, and then to offer some entry points into a dialogue. In that sense, yes, we are working to try to kind of to switch back to that type of interest in religion, in a kind of shared notion of religion. I mean, also knowing that Islam is more than religion in that sense. I mean, so I partly understand that one does not want to reduce Islam only to religion, but the core of Islam is religion. Yeah, and then we are working on it. And if you can partner with us, you can probably give us a hand in making this kind of shift back, because there is a force who's pushing towards shifting back into that. At the time of Wilfred Cantor-Smith, he was really, and that's the good side of it, he was really against the incipient center of Middle Eastern studies, which were Cold War oriented, and he was very much against them. And so that's the good side of that heritage that one needs to revive. Yeah.
Would you say you are the only one doing it, or I mean, does it influence outside? I mean, the Americans are they changing?
Americans,
the Europeans, are they changing?
No, of course.
The appreciation of
what has been mentioned about Germany. This is a very good point about novelties in Europe that might be, but as a kind of positive change. That's a positive change, and then I'm almost proud that this is coming from Germany, because I've been spending a lot of my previous academic life in Germany. As far as because Canada is usually considered, I mean, rightly, as a kind of appendix of the US. I mean, if you look at the map, I mean, it cannot be otherwise. But I have to say that I myself, I mean, a little bit reluctant. I mean, there is something, for example, what happened to Smith after he kind of gave up on the dialogue at the Institute of Islamic Studies. He went to Harvard, where there was a center for the study of world religions. I have to say that he did continue his approach there. It continued, but in a kind of slightly changed atmosphere. There are still some of his former students from the center which are trying to pursue this kind of inter-religious studies and a new type of comparative religion. But also what we notice, Islamic studies, for example, is a kind of a strange version of area studies, yet mostly nowadays in the US. For example, in the international, what's it called? Sorry, the what's it called? The Association of History of Religion, the what is the acronym? Not the American Academy of Religion, but both the American Academy of Religion, but also International Association for the History of Religion.
Yeah.
I mean, the scholars of Islam are in a minority. It's very, very rare to find scholars of Islam in these associations for the study of religion. This is the topic for research. I mean, because that's strange. I mean, it's countersensical, and then there are forces working in the opposite direction, but we are still at the beginning of it. Let's try to help each other. And that if you're also interested in what's happening, in the West, I mean, but there are also counter trends to this kind of abandoning of religion. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Prof.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for bringing up Izutsu or reviving Izutsu in our consciousness. I knew Izutsu in the 80s. In fact, I included the Izutsu corpus in my thesis. My thesis in the late 1990s was on the evolution of social science and communication. So when I read Izutsu, Prof. Osman was my internal examiner. So when I was exposed to Izutsu from South Sudan, I was not in the tradition of Prof. Osman or Islamic studies. I was in the social science and sociology. And I took political science as one of the first degrees. I got 2 first degrees. And I thought that his book, God and Man in the Quran, was very relevant to the corpus of communication. I think I was the first in the world to integrate the Izutsu corpus in that context in social science or communication studies thesis. Because you look at the semantics, the structure of the Quran, and the relationship between men, the angels, and God, in communicative terms, which have not been explicated in the religious discourse in Malaysia. And also, Izutsu, you said he studied Greek. He was also studying Greek mysticism. Russian literature, he taught Russian literature. He was a polyglot and a polymath. So he brought these things together. He is the embodiment of the inter-religious dialogue. And that's how, when he studies Islam and the Quran, he brings out the quintessence of the message of the Quran and the message of men, the man as the image of God. Coincidentally, I wrote a column on Izutsu last month. Let me retrieve. The title is "The Spirit of Toshiko Izutsu: Bridging East and West, the Malay Man and the Universe." My column is titled "Tanah Air, the Homeland of the Malay Archipelago." And when I reflected upon Izutsu, and thank you for reviving my interest in Izutsu, actually. I wanted to extend this into something else. I was trying to use the framework of Ijutsu in understanding the Malay man in the Malay archipelago, how the Malay man relates to the universe in this context. And Ijutsu has provided a framework and a methodology for us to do that. It's also reflected in one of the papers in the 2008 conference.
Oh.
Yeah, I have the book. I've read the book. Another point is McGill University, the milieu and the location of McGill in Canada. Canada has been known for its peculiar way of knowledge production. One of which is Marshall McLuhan. Canada does not have the colonial legacy. It's not like Europe. It is not a colonial power. It's not like America. It's southern border. The imperialist late Orientalism existence. Canada intellectually would want to separate, I suppose, and it has produced some unorthodox way of looking at things, looking at philosophy. So I also resonate Ijutsu's approach to McLuhan. The medium is the message. In that sense, the Quran is the medium. And I think in his work, he also used the concept of medium, referring to Jibreel and Muhammad. Yeah, so this is another one which I think needs to be extended in our scholarship. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Prof. I think this is just, I think, a comment. Okay. Dr. Mehmet Uzay, go ahead.
Bismillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you very much for your kind presentations and to both of you, professors. I think, McGill, I would like to say a few things, if I'm not mistaken, to understand what have been talked over here. McGill or Canada quotes the time after the Second World War, I guess. As Prof. American Hoja mentioned, that it was not a colonial power, it was a new power at that time. And they quote the time to invest this intellectuality, I guess. And the second one, Muslim world at the time, Katmir Hoja, busy in nation states buildings and the multiple problems. That's why the Pakistan universities or intellectual environments did not invest these individuals. Regarding to this Ijutsu, I would like to go back to history and the geography. As we know that Japanese already existed present in Malay world, starting from 16th century, 7th century. And after Meiji investment in modernization, they were invested much in Malay world, in Malaya, in Nusantara, Indonesia, archipelago. What I mean is that they had already acknowledged Islam, I guess. So my question is that, is there any local source influential on the Ijutsu's development, intellectual development? I mean, local source, not necessarily Muslim Japanese, but Islamic understanding transferred from this historical perspective to Japan, and probably he read, he talked with people. The second one is that Musa Jarullah and Abdul Rashid Ibrahim. Okay, Abdul Rashid Ibrahim probably mostly activist, but Musa Jarullah was an ulama. What their contribution influences on Ijutsu in this methodology? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for this precious information. Yes, the Japanese, yes, indeed, Japanese have had contacts with Southeast Asia, starting from like 16th century onwards, and then on and off. And so, but when it comes to what Ijutsu wrote about Southeast Asian Islam, there was only one, as far as we know, there's only one short booklet about think it's the system of Sharia in Eastern Java. I think it was Eastern Java. It was very specific. And this, as far as we know, again, this is the only type of work that he produced at under the order of the military informed research institutions. He would look into what is going on in the ground reality of Southeast Asia. Apart from that, he almost never mentioned Southeast Asia. We might still find something, hopefully we will, but so far he restricted himself to mystical philosophy, and then what you might consider a tasawwuf, but not much about the Mali word per se. Do you want?
Yes, but in spite of that, I mean, on the positive side, and your latest contribution and the one of Professor Americana, and then also the previous one, I mean, they are so encouraging for us because, you know, actually, even when we got to know about this book on Izutsu produced by INTER-CIVILISATIONAL, I think it was not just, you know, having a reception by INTER-CIVILISATIONAL on Izutsu, but also about creating this link between you know, almost the kind of linguistic and religious anthropology of the Malay world, about which I myself still have to learn so much, and then whether Izutsu also with this idea, I mean, of language, media, and communication, starting the book Language and Magic, if this type of approach really might create some kind of special synthesis or syntony with the Malay word. I mean, if it's not only that, you know, kind of applying Izutsu to the Malay word, but the other way, if the historical experience of the Malay word and then the development of this type of multi-layered Islamic culture and cosmopolitan Nusantara culture might also, you know, throw back some light on Izutsu and update and enrich Izutsu nowadays. I mean, so this would be the deepest ambition in terms of learning and updating, I mean, the heritage of Izutsu, that this might be the best, exactly the best cultural, civilizational, and religious terrain, I mean, for this type of Izutsu revival. And this, all the three latest contributions, I think, are so encouraging in that sense. But that's something we are still a kind of on the learning side of it, rather than, I mean, in spite of the fact that Izutsu's direct engagement, I mean, at least what we found until now was really very limited. So,
if I may, Izutsu's rendition of the position of men in the universe resonates some of the Sufic narratives in the Malay Hikayats. Interestingly so. So that kind of interaction. Yeah.
Without him knowing that it did the exact.
Yeah, that's that. You want to say?
Yeah, can I add very quickly that then, despite his official output focused on philosophical and then mystical literature and then some bit of a history of thought in Islam, it came to light that he was very also cognizant of what happens in history, that historical occurrence, like for example Mongol invasion and other big events that he suspected that might have changed the course of development in Islamic thought. And so he was also paying in a slightly less official level to the ground level social structure that influenced the way that thought developed. So yeah, and he probably thought that then we would uncover after his death, we will uncover more about what happens in this past. Yeah.
So it's almost like a triangle between the Izutsu's heritage, I mean, the Malay world, and also Central Asia. And then so that we are also very interested in the mutual engagement at this cosmological level between the Malay world and Central Asia. So whatever, if you can recommend anything, because that, and then of course with Islam bringing everything together.
No, I just want to say something. as points raised by Professor Murad. If we look at the all these early scholars, what united them? What united them in their thinking? It's very interesting, that it's something to be something that needs to be researched. I don't know the details, but what I observe is this: their concern with what is known, what we call worldview. Worldview. In other words, in the 50s, in the 1960s, the early scholars of Islam, in order to show that Islam is different from the other traditions, is to appeal to refer to the worldview of the different philosophies and religions. Even Izutsu, he talks about what is that worldview. In other words, so in that worldview, the three, well, it basically is about the conception of man, the conception of God, and the conception of the universe. So these three. So if you look at the writings of Al-Attas, Fazlur Rahman, Syed Hussein Nasr, all concentrate on that to emphasize that Islam has a different worldview compared to the others. And now, of course, we accept that something. We want to talk. We want to discuss, and we want to talk about first the worldview. What is our view? Yeah. So that is interesting. The thinking at that time in the 50s, in the 1960s. If you look at the thesis of Syed Hussein Nasr, the thesis of Faruqi, talks about the metaphysics of values. His thesis on metaphysics of values, and Fazlur Rahman, of course, his thesis on Ibn Sina's psychology. Yeah, in psychology. So I try to understand how Islamic studies have developed, but also this inter-religious dialogue, because there was one of the great themes in that inter-religious dialogue is precisely the question of how each religion views God, man, and the universe.
Yeah, thank you, Prof. Alhamdulillah, that's a great summary of the whole situation. That's good. I think that we have another 6 minutes to 12. There is one question here, maybe for Prof and Doctor to look at before I wrap up the discussion today. The question says, in what ways does Izutsu's approach to comparative philosophy shed light on the unique aspects of Islamic thought and its compatibility with other philosophical traditions? That's another lecture.
Okay, I finally get to start. That's the really pertinent and ideal questions to come at the end, because I was really resisting mentioning his later work, which precisely deals with that. And this revolves around his one book. It was a very interesting book with the scholarly content, but it's not scholarly in the sense that there are no footnotes. There are no chapter headings, just numbers. And then this is the book called what was the book? Yes. Consciousness and Essence in Japanese. And in this, he probably put together what he had done all those years previously. And what he does is that he puts forth what he regards as a common structure of, on one level, this spiritual experience as expressed in all different spiritual literatures, from Tasawwuf to Zen Buddhism, to Jewish Kabbalah, to literalism, and then other things, some strands of Confucianism. And he also see this structure as common structure as indicating or explaining how human consciousness is structured in different levels. If you can see it in the sort of different spiritual stages that you can experience in Sufi contemplation, for example. And he sees it in different traditions as well. So this is a great, what I call parallelism. He doesn't say at the end of the day, because they are therefore they are the same. He doesn't say anything. He just a little bit like his big scholarly smile, you know, and after pointing out all these parallels. So this is the book that is to be translated. It's very important thing.
Yeah, thank you very much, Doctor. I think this is a very good intellectual conversation today. And I think this triggers other maybe other sessions, other programs, other activities that can be collaborated between Istac and your institute in McGill University and in other places in the West, whether in Europe or Canada or USA. As far as Istac is concerned, International Institute of Islamic Thought and Civilization is concerned, we are like the face of Malaysia and the Ummah to the rest of the world, because we use English as a medium of instruction, and also we focus on Islamic thought, civilization, epistemology, philosophy of science, history of science, from a revealed comparative perspective. That's why Istac is in a position to go into this intercultural, intercivilizational, interfaith kind of engagement with the West. And in this institute, in the last few years, we engaged with China, with Buddhism, with Confucianism, with Islam in many parts of the world. And we are continuing this drive to this. As far as what we discussed today is concerned, I would like to thank Professor Armando and Dr. KEIKO for all the ideas and the views that they have put forward. I think there are many things in between that need in-depth analysis and needs discussions. As far as the idea of studying Islam or Islamic studies, whether in the West or in the East or in the Islamic world, it's a very crucial question. And of course, there are many methodologies, as you mentioned, from the anthropological, cultural, social, to the Sufi, mystic approach, theological approach, Orientalism, colonization, decolonization approaches. But in the end, what is important for us to understand here, especially in Istac, in what we do for postgraduate students and our scholars, is that in the end, as Prof. Osman Bakar mentioned, we deal with Islam as a worldview. And when we say we deal with Islam as a worldview, we deal with Islam as a civilization. We deal with Islam as a civilization which is guided by revealed knowledge, and that revealed knowledge is not corrupted, it's not altered, it's not changed. So we start in our worldview with the definition of religion itself. And that's why our big difference from the Western perspective is that religion in the West, in general, is a cultural product, is a human product, is a historical product. That's why Professor Al-Attas in his Prolegomena to Metaphysics and also Islam and Secularism, he says that when he defines Islamic worldview, he says that Islamic worldview is not something that undergoes historical modification and changes, but it's the revealed world word of God, which provides you with that guidance. Here, where our perspective of studying Islamic studies starts. And that's where the differences come later on. So what I wanted to say, when we deal with, we are for comparative. If Islam is universal religion, it's impossible for Islam to be inward, to be exclusive. By the nature of the text, you know, the epistemological characteristics of Islam. Number one is universal. Number two is preserved and protected by God. Number three is complete. Number four is acknowledging the existence of all other religions before, but it has the ability and the power of dominating over other religions when it comes to muhaiminan alayhi. Means Islam as a word of God has that methodology to reconstruct history from a revealed perspective. That's why to us, Christianity is our heritage, Judaism is our heritage, and so on and so forth. So in this understanding, our study of Islamic studies and approach to Islamic studies need actually to take into account this type of thing. So that's why Izitsu, for example, in his approach, the semantical approach, which Al-Faruqi somehow objected, I myself, I have an objection, but from my own perspective, not the great perspective of Al-Faruqi. It's great. Well, I quoted him in many places in my PhD at that time, 1996. So it's great. And for the first time, us as scholars of that time, we see how a scholar, non-Arab scholar, non-Muslim scholar, looks at the networks of the meanings and the semantical meanings of the terms Islam. He go and the hadith of Jibril, you know, hadith of Jibril, Iman, Islam, Ihsan, and he wrote more than 200 pages on that one. Where people, if they want to write about Islam, Iman, Ihsan, the 10 pages finish already. You put all your hikmah, you finish. But this man wrote all this because of that semantical approach. But though it's important and as a stage or a phase towards understanding the Quran, but it's not enough. What's next? What's after you create the semantical network of meanings? What's next in your understanding of the Quran? If you get all this network and you understand the Quran at only the linguistic perspective, then you are at that level. But if you go to the level of the fiqh, you are at that level. Then you go to the level of ijtihad and trying to understand the Quran. Then you go to the level of the worldview, where you talk about man, God, universe, and life, and all this. Then you go to the level where this semantic of the Quran becomes actually your methodology to build a civilization, being a vicegerent of God on earth. Here we enter into the Umran model, the civilizational model of Islamic studies, where it's more than the mystic level, the spiritual level, the theology level. No, you put all this to bring that model of Islam. That's what you call here in Malaysia nowadays, Madani, Tamaddun, civilization. Istikhlaf means building a balanced civilization that bridges that gap between the soul and the mind, between hereafter and this world, between politics and fiqh, between science and consciousness. We are lost because of the positivistic, naturalistic, postmodernistic model that actually redefined the human in a different way, redefined religion in a different way. So I think that's our approach. If we really need to understand Islam and study Islamic studies, is for Umran. is for civilization, is for building hayatun tayyibah, the desirable life that God wants and puts in the Quran. Other than this, it's all partial. So that's, I think, our approach, Prof. And that's what we are trying to advance in Istac here, the epistemological, civilizational, value-driven approach to Islamic thought and Islamic civilization. So, inshallah, I think there will be a lot of discussions, a lot of engagements with your side. I told you we will be having an international conference on the renewal of Islamic thought and civilization, and we will invite you, both of you, to deliver from your perspective. That's why I think, as our professors mentioned here, inter-civilizational cultural studies is one of the mainstream areas in Istac here. So intercultural or comparative is a must. Interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary is a must in this place here. So that's actually how we look at the idea. But we really appreciate what you have brought and the project that you are doing now. Maybe your next project will be with our professors and researchers here at Istac. If there is no any other thing, I will wrap up. Prof, you want to say another thing?
Thanking you all again. I mean, and Professor Abdulaziz and Professor Osman and then Professor Murad and then all of you. Thanks. This is a learning experience for us.
Yeah, thank you very much, everyone. Alhamdulillah. We come to the end of this very intellectual conversation. It's the beginning of other sessions in the future. Just to remind all our brothers, as I mentioned, and we sent already posters before, on the 20th of July, we will be having our Istac World Professorial Lecture with Professor Edward Muad in Istac here. And we will remind you again for that event. With this one, we end this session today. Once again, very great thank you to our Professor Armando, to our Dr. KEIKO, to all our professors and doctors. For your information, another 36 people were following us and following this. And why we recorded it, we wanted it to remain as a legacy of this institute here, and we will provide a copy to Professor, inshallah. Before leaving this place for our lunch and then for prayer, we would like to give a token of appreciation to our two professors today. Welcome.